Hello and welcome to Fire in the Valley. Today we have myself, Mighty Pete, and we're joined by the Storm Cunningham. Good afternoon, or good morning to you, I should say.
Hey, Pete. Thanks for having me on your show.
Listen, thanks very much. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. So, Storm, tell us, who are you, where are you calling from, and what do you do?
Well, calling from Washington, D.C., and for the past 20 years or so, I've been basically helping folks restore the planet, revitalize their communities, boost climate resilience, and been doing it from the standpoint of initially an author. My first book, The Restoration Economy, came out in 2002, and that was basically my escape from the 9-to-5 world. And since then, have primarily earned my living as a public speaker, workshop leader, doing workshops, keynotes all over the planet, dozens of countries and dozens of universities, basically helping people revitalize places for a living. And it's recently morphed into something a little more substantial in the Reconomics Institute at reconomics.org, where we're now offering certification so that people can actually get certified as a revitalization or resilience facilitator and earn their living doing the kinds of stuff I've been doing, only more hands-on. I don't actually do anything useful. I mean, I just basically write about and talk about other people who are actually doing useful things and help them learn the most efficient ways of doing them.
I like that. So you're like the Vaseline. You're the bit that makes it all go smoothly, right? To move things forward.
No, I help them understand, how other people have done it well. So I'm kind of, I've probably heard more stories of successes and failures regarding making places better than anybody else on the planet, because from all of those hundreds of talks and workshops I've done around the world, most of them were at conferences and summits, where there are dozens of other speakers. So for every one I did, I usually heard at least a dozen. And so I've been spending the whole time looking for commonalities, I guess you could say, or universal principles, what in the cities that have come back to life in a spectacular way, or neighborhoods or ecosystems or whatever, in the ones that have really come back from a desperate situation into just wonderful vibrancy and health and productivity. What did the successes have in common? And for the failures, what did they have in common? And so my most recent book just came out last year, called Reconomics, The Path to Resilient Prosperity, really distills that in 400 pages, distills all of those lessons as to, what exactly it takes to be successful in bringing a place back to life.
Oh, wow. And I'm sort of curious. Well, first of all, I mean, have you seen a change? I mean, can you, over that, you're saying with your first book in 2002 and sort of ultimately now, well, what would have been 18 years later, you've, this other book. And I mean, have you seen remarkable change? Are people learning? Are we growing and improving?
Oh, absolutely. It's very easy to get pessimistic, if not downright depressed, looking at the situation from a global standpoint. Obviously, in terms of species extinctions and carbon in the atmosphere and all of this, things are still getting worse. But then when you take a look at more of the microscopic perspective of particular neighborhoods, particular cities, particular organizations that are doing this really restorative, revitalizing, regenerative work, all of a sudden you see the exact opposite. You see places that are the epitome of what it's going to take to restore the climate, to revitalize the biosphere. And, sometimes it's like an individual farm that's on the leading edge of regenerative agriculture, which, my first book, The Restoration Economy, was one of the first books to document regenerative agriculture, because I wrote it back in the mid 90s. It took 6 years to finish writing it. And at that time, there were just a few people on the planet who were even thinking about it, like the Rodale Institute. They were the ones who really pioneered it. And so when I came out with a whole chapter on regenerative agriculture, people were just scratching their heads and saying, "What do what you're saying, farmers are the enemy. They're the ones who are destroying nature. Now you're saying that a farm could actually restore the watershed and restore biodiversity and restore native pollinators and actually have more topsoil at the end of every year than it had the year before, and better quality topsoil." And and now more recently, the reason you hear regenerative agriculture mentioned a lot more frequently is that about 5 years ago, they documented that when done properly, regenerative agriculture actually sequesters 4 times more carbon than reforestation. So now it's become a climate solution on top of all those other benefits. And on top of all of that, it's more profitable. Most farms that have switched over to regenerative techniques, they don't necessarily have more productivity, more products that come out the other end. What they've done is slash their expenses by 60 or 70%, which goes straight to the bottom line. And all of a sudden, an unprofitable farm becomes highly profitable. I say you're on mute, Pete.
Got it. So what is it that makes that stand out? I mean, when you say this, I mean, are you heading down the organic side, or what is it that makes it stand out for somebody who's just sort of really learning about this?
You're talking about regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, the regenerative agriculture. Yeah.
Well, the there's a lot of like in almost any environmental movement, there's a lot of greenwashing these days. A lot of big companies jumping on the bandwagon now that it's become popular, and some of them, in many cases, it's good news. I mean, that's what you want. You want these good things happening on a massive scale. So when somebody like General Mills comes in and commits 6 million acres to regenerative agriculture, it can be considered a good thing. The trouble is that there are a lot of companies out there, the ones who have been making their money all along on industrial agriculture that depletes the topsoil and poisons it. The ones who are making farm equipment and fertilizers and herbicides, they're looking at it and saying, okay, how can we spin this in such a way that we sell more of our traditional crap? And they're doing that. So a lot of them will ignore the other aspects of regenerative agriculture, like restoring the watershed and restoring biodiversity, and just focus on one aspect, like no-till. So they'll say, okay, well, we're not going to plow the fields anymore, so that means it's regenerative. But because you're not plowing the fields anymore, you really need to spread a lot more glyphosate on them, Roundup. And so, yeah, you got to be careful. There are people who are not always the best actors. But in general, no-till is a major component of it. When you stop disrupting the topsoil like that, then it can become a lot more firmly entrenched in root networks, so it doesn't wash away during heavy storms. So you're conserving its topsoil that way. Also by not tilling it, not dumping toxic pesticides and herbicides and industrial style fertilizers on there, you're not killing the biome. So now all the living creatures that make good topsoil are coming back to life. And and by not spreading toxic materials on there, you're helping to restore the watershed. And a lot of people actually do ecological restoration on their farms. So if they've got a stream running through there and they've got some cattle, for instance, they do some what's called riparian restoration. Riparian is the edges of streams and rivers. And so they'll plant those in native trees or bushes or whatever that help keep the cattle out of the stream, and also shade the stream because a lot of the streams that are dying of heat. We've taken away all their shade, and now the fish that require cool water, like trout, can't use the stream anymore.
Oh wow! I mean, I was gonna say it's relatively simple, right? When you explain it like that,
it's all simple. It's all simple.
So it's not
Yeah.
about, sometimes it's not about doing more. In fact, it's the reverse. I
Hmm.
suspect even as you speak there, I mean, some of those savings or some of the actual profitability comes from doing less rather than doing more, right?
Right. Right.
Just having that scale.
Exactly.
Oh, so it makes a lot of
Trouble is
sense.
that there are a whole lot of massive corporations out there that make their money off of doing more,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they've got no interest in seeing us do less.
Well, okay. Before we really get into it, I suppose, first of all, what does fire in the belly mean to you then, Storm? I mean, what is it all about?
Well, I mean, I've always been a fairly fiery guy, I guess you could say. You know, I graduated high school in California during the height of the hippie years in the San Francisco Bay Area, and naturally became a hippie, um, and had my first entrepreneurial experiences selling substances that I'd rather not mention, and
Herbal,
and
obviously.
yeah, so. I was rebelling at that point, but then everybody was rebelling if they were my age. So that was kind of like going along with the crowd. And then I decided that I really needed to know more about how the world works, how the universe works. Um, before I go off to college, I need to know who I am and how I fit into all of this. So at that time, the uh, general consensus was that all the truth was over in India.
Hmm.
So I stuck out my thumb and, well, saved up a few bucks to fly over to Italy, and stuck out my thumb and hitchhiked from Italy over to India and Nepal and looking for the truth. And oh, excuse me, I forgot to turn off my Skype. Um, and took about a month and a half to get over there. Had quite an adventure along the way. That was back in the days when you could hitchhike across Afghanistan without stepping on landmines.
So what are we talking here? This the 80s?
No, that would have been 71
Well, okay.
when I made that trip. I did another trip around this just before that when I was living on Ibiza and just hitchhiking all around Europe. Um, but what happened when the fire really hit my belly was when I got back from about 3 or 4 months of seeking the truth over in the Far East, and within a month after returning, I was in the army. Not drafted, strangely enough, having been a rabid, peace-loving hippie. I found myself suddenly saying, I really need to get my act together. I've been living off other people now for a while now, living off the kindness of strangers, and it's been fun. But I really need to learn some kind of skill and get my head on straight as far as actually being a contributing member. I had no interest in slaughtering Vietnamese farmers at the time, and was quite happy not to go over there. As a matter of fact, if they had tried to draft me the year before, I would have headed off to Canada or Sweden or somewhere. But all of a sudden, it just felt like the right thing to do. And I figured my dream was to get trained as an airframe mechanic by the Army and become a bush pilot in Australia or Alaska or somewhere like that. And the Army had other ideas in mind. They decided, oops, God, I thought I turned that off. Hang on a second. I don't know who that is, but let me kill Skype. Um, so the Army decided, based on my um, aptitudes, that I'd be a better uh, uh, medic. And I had absolutely zero interest in being a medic at that time. But they went ahead and sent me to medical school, and turned out I loved it. Once I got into it. And so I asked them, well, here I am, just an enlisted man. What's the absolute best medical training I could possibly get? And they said, well, that's in special forces. You have to become a Green Beret. And I said, yeah, right. A couple of months ago, I had long hair and wearing a Sherpa robe, hitchhiking around India. And now they want me to become a Green Beret. And they said, but the good news is that you get the medical training first. So if you don't like special forces, you can just drop out because it's an all volunteer outfit. They don't have anybody who doesn't want to be there. So um, uh, I figured, well, heck, the training course is 9 months, and it's supposed to be the most intense medical training on the planet. Because the Green Beret medic, the Green Beret teams operate behind enemy lines,
Mm.
so they're primarily teachers. Green Beret team's supposed to be able to train and equip a 4,000-man guerrilla battalion, and they're not supposed to actually do the fighting themselves. So they're basically teachers, and the medic teaches medicine, the weapons guys teach weapons, and engineer teaches how to build bridges and blow them up. And so I went through this, and their idea of medical school encompasses everything from jungle medicine, herbs, to veterinary, dentistry, OBGYN, because you're living with these tribal people in many cases, like the Montagnards in Vietnam, and saving their water buffalo is probably the best way to make friends with them. So, you learned all kinds of stuff, cutting out tumors, cutting off legs, we did it all. And uh, I discovered while I was in there that, man, these are the best guys I've met in the Army. They're the most intelligent, uh, totally non-conventional, non-army types. I mean, they chose the people who were capable of operating on their own. You're supposed to be able to complete the mission even if the other 11 guys on the team are down. And so they basically wanted entrepreneurial mindsets and free thinkers who could invent their own solutions and not have to go by the book. And I thought, man, I love this culture. I'm going to stay with them. And so I ended up becoming a medic on a scuba team.
Oh, wow.
And that, strangely enough, led to my becoming a ecological restoration champion. Because some 20 years later, there was a German scientist operating in Jamaica who was trying to restore Jamaica's coral reefs, which they only had about 10% of them left at that point. And he had invented what became the world's first coral reef restoration technology. And he needed some volunteers to help, dive qualified volunteers to go down there and help him install these experiments on the ocean floor. So I went down there for a week and saw these places that he'd been working on for the last couple of years, places that had been absolute lifeless deserts on the ocean floor, coral reefs that had completely been killed. Within just months coming back to life, covered in colorful hard and soft corals and fish and all kinds of life swimming around them. And it was just, that's about as close to doing magic for a living as I could imagine. And I thought, wow, all of a sudden I realized that we don't have to be satisfied with just sustainability. I mean, you look around at the planet, this place is a total mess right now. Who wants to sustain this? We need to make it better. And I realized, we don't have to be satisfied with just conserving what's left of nature. We can actually restore the damage we've already done. And that led to my first book, The Restoration Economy.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's quite something. And even as you speak, I'm inspired by, the fact that you mightn't necessarily have the tools, whether you are, as you say, you're sort of almost behind enemy lines type thing, but you're teaching and training, you're not necessarily coming, but you're there to impart knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
inspire, as opposed to coming with, truckloads of stuff. It's the reverse, right? Is to use the tools that you have at hand.
Yeah, basically, I'm doing the same thing I did in special forces, only restoring places rather than blowing them up.
Wow, that's quite a shift. It really is. What I mean, out of interest, I mean, that's quite a pivot, I suppose. And was it really understanding in the fact that, one, you got to see so many places around the world? I mean, when you start to see what's possible in terms of regeneration, is that what inspired you? Was that something just you were drawn to?
Well, yeah, once you become attuned to it and become aware of the fact that restoration even exists, you start seeing it everywhere. Especially, after I wrote that first book, which documented, it created kind of a taxonomy of 8 sectors of restorative development, 4 of them in the built environment, which were catastrophe reconstruction, brownfields redevelopment, which are contaminated lands, infrastructure renewal, and historic, heritage structure restoration. And then 4 of them are on the natural side, which are ecosystem restoration, fisheries restoration, agricultural restoration, and watershed restoration. So you put them all together and you basically cover, virtually all key life-giving functions on the planet. And after I wrote the book, or even while I was still writing it, I became so attuned to it that I realized I was seeing restoration, redevelopment, regeneration, revitalization, reconnection, repurposing, renewing, reusing, all the stuff. I was surrounded by it all the time and just never really noticed it before.
Wow. It's so inspiring actually to see that. I mean, I'm assuming here, and it's never right to assume. I mean, to restore the planet, one of the best things we could do is get off the planet. Is that fair, or does some of this restoration?
What, and destroy somewhere else?
Well, hopefully not. We go and we learn our lessons, and we go somewhere else and leave the planet to repair itself, right?
Learning our lessons is a mighty big assumption.
Well, we're just in this sort of magical world that we're going to, but I'm assuming that actually nature is and I suppose going back to the best thing you can do is let nature do what nature does. Is that a fair?
Oh, I'm sure if humans disappeared from the planet, it would restore itself really fast. I mean, we wouldn't get back the species that we've lost, but in a few million years, nature would evolve species that were very similar, at least functionally, to the ones that are extinct now. So, but that's not likely to happen, unless a really serious pandemic. I mean, one that makes the present one look like a joke.
Yeah.
But if something came along and wiped out 90% of humanity, then sure, the planet would start restoring itself pretty well. It would still be radioactive for another few tens of thousands of years, thanks to Chernobyl and Fukushima and all the tens of thousands of 55-gallon drums of radioactive waste that have been dumped in our oceans that are now rupturing and rusting. And so, yeah, it's not going to be the same planet it was before, but we have to operate from a standpoint of, well, maybe nature is not going to save the planet with a truly horrendous pandemic. So what can we do meanwhile? And the simple, well, not easy, but simple solution is to shift our economy. I mean, it's our economy that's making all the difference. And so we just need to shift our economy from this old pioneering mode of sprawling and extracting virgin resources to a restorative mode and the good thing is you can make just as much money restoring the world as you can depleting it. So there's already a $1 trillion, couple $1 trillion restoration economy going on out there. So it's just trouble is it's not well documented. Most countries' accounting systems still only measure new development and maintenance. And they forget about all the end of life cycle stuff, the stuff that starts with that just gets lumped into the other things. So it's this huge, fast growing, inspiring economic sector that's basically invisible because nobody's measuring it properly.
But even as you speak there, it's you kind of get this picture of it's actually, we're in this sort of throwaway society, right? It's cheaper and easier and whatever else to throw it away, get a new one. And until you tax accordingly or incentivize otherwise, right? That cycle is going to continue.
Or yeah, the key to all of this is full cost accounting. If we just install full cost accounting at every level, the situation is solved because automatically you can the economic benefits of restoring rather than destroying become plainly obvious. Right now, somebody can go out there and destroy a mangrove swamp and create a shrimp farm. And it looks like economic development. It looks like it's good for the country because they're not measuring the lost value of those mangroves, all the millions of fish that they were going to create. So they've destroyed this fishery in order to create a shrimp farm. and the shrimp farm probably won't last more than 20 or 30 years, and then you've got nothing. You've lost your fishery and your shrimp farm. So yeah, if you had full cost accounting, then they would know ahead of time exactly what the cost of restoring that mangrove swamp would be, and what the cost of all the lost fishery production would be. And if they still decided they wanted to create the shrimp farm, they'd have to pay a restoration deposit up front, which would be huge and would probably kill the whole project right up front. It's already happening on a limited scale, in most parts of North America. Like in Alberta, Canada, if you want to create a new oil well, you've got to put up a restoration deposit.
Wow.
And they've taken, I mean, that's common throughout America right now, and probably many other places. What Alberta did was they said, not only do you have to put up a restoration deposit so that when the oil well is depleted, you have to restore the site to its previous condition, they said you have to continue paying into this restoration until that site is certified as fully ecologically restored, however long that takes. So it's not just a fixed amount. It could go on for a century.
Wow. Full. I mean, how do you justify full restoration?
Well, that's the key.
Mm,
Alberta is run by oil companies, and most of the
mm,
politicians there are owned by the oil companies. So it'd be very easy for them just to adjust the definition of fully restored according to the oil company's preferences. So
mm.
you just kind of have to hope that honest government will exist long enough for restoration to really be restoration, and not just uh, slapping some astroturf on top of the well and running
Yeah.
away.
Wow. Tell me, I mean, do you think, is there many more ticking time bombs? I mean, have we stemmed the flow? Because I mean, you talk about sort of, almost nuclear waste and our methods of methods of disposal, if you like, and that's all stuff. You would kind of hope that our sins of our forefathers, if you like. I mean, have we learnt the lessons? Have we stemmed the flow of ticking time bombs that are going to come back and haunt us?
Some
Or
of the worst examples of it, yeah. I mean, we're still building new nuclear plants, so we still got more Chernobyls and Fukushimas coming in the future.
mm,
But as far as legally dumping radioactive materials and other toxic materials in the ocean, which we did, constantly in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Russia, UK, US, just about everybody was doing it, and they didn't even pay attention to where they were dumping it. They didn't. They didn't look forward and say, well, someday we might want to actually take this stuff out before the drums rupture. So let's make a map of where we dumped it. Nope, no maps. So we're gonna have to spend billions of dollars just finding this stuff.
my
So
goodness.
yeah, there are a lot more bombs out there.
Just waiting. Tell me, how'd you get on in India? Did you make it to India?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it's like I said, it took about a month and a half to hitchhike from Italy to India, and another month and a half to hitchhike back. I also went up to Nepal and absolutely loved India. As a matter of fact, I still have a daily connection to India because my websites are all created by a fellow I've been working with in India named J. Pipavat. He's got a company called eastwestweb.com, and does a wonderful job. And he's in Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat, which is interesting because Gujarat has some of the best, most innovative government programs. There's a story I've been telling for a long time. I did a TEDx talk in Washington, D.C., I think about a dozen years ago, and where one of the stories that people loved the most was how uh, Pakistan, down on the coast of Gujarat, Gujarat is on the borders Pakistan, and they share a huge gulf there. On the Pakistani side, they had conserved their mangroves. So the fishing was really good there because mangroves act as fisheries. That's where all the
Hmm,
little baby fish go to hide while they're growing up.
sure.
And But on the Indian side, they destroyed most of their mangroves, and the fishing sucked over there. So the Indian fishermen were sneaking over at night to fish on the Pakistani side, and they were getting shot. And it was threatening to become a full-fledged conflagration. So the Indians, the Gujarat government decided the best way to maintain the peace would be to replant, restore the mangroves on the Indian side to restore the fisheries, so that their fishermen wouldn't have to steal the fish from the Pakistanis. So it was a great example of restoring peace by restoring nature.
Wow. And isn't it powerful actually how you can shift the power, right? So instead of trying, it's counterintuitive. So, if you want more fish, clear the area, but then exactly as you say, then there's no habitat for the spawn or whatever it is to actually create. So there is a slight counterintuitiveness to the whole thing, isn't it? That it's placing it back into nature's hands as opposed to going the industrial, bigger's better and scaling it, right? It's just that
Yeah,
change.
it's nature's hands, but it's also still economic development. It's still
Mm.
growing the economy when they're replanting those mangroves and revitalizing their fisheries. I mean, fisheries account worldwide for about 10% of the total global economy.
Well,
So it's no small thing.
that's massive, isn't it? When you scale it that way,
Yeah.
going through. What I mean, comparing, I suppose, Eastern methods to Western methods. I mean, what was your takeaway from that? And your sort of learnings and lessons in India and really sort of traveling, I suppose, versus the Western
Yeah.
world.
Well, it's especially healthy for Americans to travel because it's a we're a very insular country here. For most Americans, don't believe they've got anything to learn from the rest of the world. We're just the epitome of everything good, and couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong. So it's Americans, desperately need to travel more if we're going to save this country. And my wife's from Mexico, and we spend a month and a half in Mexico every year, which is tremendously therapeutic because Mexico's the most Native American intensive country on the planet. Just about everybody in Mexico, although the ruling class is still primarily pure blood Spanish conquistador types. The vast majority of Mexico's population is either full-blooded Indian or mestizo, half Spanish and half Indian. So it's a very indigenous oriented culture. So when you get away from the big cities, you're talking about a very, very different culture. Culture that eats insects as a normal
Hmm.
just thing. They realize, it's great protein. They're delicious. They're all over the place. Look at these dumb Americans wasting all this food, and letting them eat their crops, or poisoning their crops to get rid of them when they could just be harvesting them instead and eating them. At every public market you go to in Mexico, you'll find baskets of fried grasshoppers or crickets, grillos fritos, and they're delicious. In fact, just the other day, I can't remember now. Do you guys get the 17-year cicadas in Britain?
I don't believe so. No.
Uh, no, okay, probably a North American thing. So they're these big bugs, very noisy bugs that come out. They're about 2 inches long, heavy-bodied. They spend 17 years underground sucking on plant saps, sucking on roots. And after 17 years, they emerge and spend a couple of weeks singing very, very loudly. And we're talking, billions of them. And they fly around looking for a mate. They can't eat. They don't even have mouths. They're just living off their body fat. And so these huge clouds of noisy insects flying all over the place. It's actually a beautiful sound. Some people don't like them, but every decade or so, there's a brood that's especially large, and we're getting one of those super large broods right now, where literally trillions of cicadas are coming out all over the eastern United States. And That's an incredible amount of protein. And the fact is, they're quite delicious. It's a major boon to wildlife. I mean, everything from foxes to possums to snakes. Everybody eats cicadas except the people.
Mhm.
So the Washington Post had an article recently with cicada recipes for those who'd like to give it a try. And so I read that and thought, well, okay, it's time for me to try. And just a few hours after reading the article, I was digging in my garden, putting in a new tomato plant, and there were a couple of big fat cicada larvae that hadn't emerged yet. And that's one of the forms that's best to eat. And so I tossed them in a skillet with some butter, and I had some leftover homemade pad thai from the day before. So I put a couple of forks full of pad thai in there and had cicada pad thai, and it was absolutely wonderful. That just an example of the kinds of things I might not have done had I not been exposed to all these Native Americans in Mexico who just took insect eating to be the most normal thing in the world. So it's a healthy influence.
Isn't it funny? And even that is a case of, instead of going against what nature is, because I mean nature is, the world, and it's huge. Whilst humans are powerful, nature sort of makes us look like ants in comparison. So
Right.
instead of trying to fight it and say, let's get rid of these bugs and spray them and kill them and squash them and do whatever,
Yep.
those that, I don't know, I'm not going to say they have less resources, but those that are more resourceful, see the opportunity, right?
Yep. Oh,
Instead
and I,
of,
I forgot to mention that they were delicious too.
there you go. So
Very much like shrimp. As a matter of
mm,
fact, they look a lot like shrimp. I mean, shrimp are basically just ocean insects. So it's really not that much different. Um, the what's really tragic is places like Africa, where they get these huge swarms of locusts that eat their crops, and I'm not seeing anybody harvesting them. I've searched and searched, and yes, some people are saying they should be harvesting them and eating them, but I'm not seeing anybody actually doing it. These people are starving, literally starving, because their crops have been wiped out. They've got probably the best protein on the planet sitting right there. All they have to do is run out and grab them and cook them, and it's all just going to waste. If they do anything about it, they're spraying pesticides at them. It's just such an incredible disconnect.
isn't that bizarre, isn't it? When you think about it, there's so many resources at our fingertips, and yet we're spending
Yep.
sort of an inordinate amount of time and resources to get rid of them, to then need to bring agriculture or something else to bring it back, right?
Yeah, it's the same with algae. You talk to engineers who are talking about how they had a big fish die off in this lake or canal or whatever because of the algae. And the algae is not the problem. The nutrients that are creating the algae are the problem. If you dump fertilizers from lawns and farms into the body of water, that's going to feed the algae. And algae is like any other plant. It creates oxygen when it's in the sunlight during the day, but it uses oxygen at night. So that's normally not a problem. The trouble is if your entire lake is filled with algae, too much of it, then at night, all that algae is going to use up all the oxygen and the fish are going to suffocate,
Mm.
which is exactly what happens. So you get these engineers running around dumping algicides into the lake, further poisoning the lake, when all they have to do is harvest the algae. The algae has already done the job of sequestering the nutrients. It's cleaned the water for you. All you have to do is take the algae out, and now your water's nice and clean. So the algae is the ultimate water purification technology. But instead of harvesting the algae and feeding it to cattle or chicken after drying it out, they're just poisoning it, which means that all of the nutrients that were sequestered by the algae now just go right back into the water again when the algae dies. Yeah, it's just, and these are professional engineers. They're actually paid to make decisions like this.
When you explain it like that, I mean, it is baffling, isn't it? Right? As you say that the algae's done the job, and then we kind of go, no, 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 we got the algae's a bad thing. That's causing the problem. It's like, no, the problem is
Mm-hmm.
the fertilizer, which triggered the algae. The algae's done that, put
Yep.
oxygen in the water until the point that it's too much. So take,
But again, it comes down to money. In most cases, the engineers are making these stupid decisions because they're working for some big chemical company that makes the algicide. So therefore, algicide is the only solution. And it's the only hammer in their toolkit. So um, where again, you go down to Mexico, like the Lago Chapala, Lake Chapala, down south of Guadalajara, has a tremendous problem with excess nutrients from all the farms around it, and from sewage coming in from Mexico City, which is actually quite a distance away. And the folks down there, since they were just trying to come up with a solution, they weren't trying to serve some giant corporation. They had the intelligence, with the help of some biologists at the University of Guadalajara, to say, okay, well, one of the big problems we have is the water hyacinths. It's the African species that plagues water bodies of fresh water all around the Americas. South America, Florida, everywhere you go, you see these water hyacinths, which are actually very pretty plants, but they
like a
shade the
water
water.
lily, are they? Is that kind of thing?
Yeah, very similar to a water lily. Yeah,
Okay.
and so they were saying, we've got to get rid of all these water hyacinths, and we've got to clean the water. Oh, wait a minute, the water hyacinths are cleaning the water. And if we dry them out, the cattle seem to enjoy eating them. So you go down to Lago Chapala and you see all these big dump trucks spilling water out the back of them because they've just been loaded up with water hyacinths, and they're heading off to a farm where they're going to dump the water hyacinths, let them dry in the sun, and then feed them to the cattle. Yeah, it just makes all the sense in the world. But yeah, it takes so-called ignorant farmers to come up with intelligent solutions like that.
Wow. I mean, is there a point when, if that then becomes part of the actual cycle, that then they could potentially fertilize the water to then trigger this?
Well, yeah. Anytime you get people dependent on a particular um, modality like that, eventually they're going to figure out how to game the system. It's like I read about one island that was trying to get rid of all the invasive rats that were destroying its economy. The rats that had escaped from European ships, centuries ago, when the explorers were running around, and so they created a bounty. They'd pay people for every rat they brought in. And naturally, people were gaming the system. They were raising rats at home and bringing them in for the bounty. So yeah, you gotta design systems to assume that people are going to game the system in some way.
But still, I mean, it does create, it puts value on a waste which previously was a cost, right? So you have,
Oh yeah, yeah,
you have repurposed a product, which
yeah,
then
sure.
changes the cycle, right?
And I don't think you have to worry about people purposely dumping fertilizer in Lake Chapala, because they're going to have more than enough fertilizer runoff naturally from their farms to keep feeding the water hyacinths for a long time to come.
That's fascinating. And it just, I mean, as you explain it like that, it's just common sense, right? It's why not work with nature as opposed to, yeah.
Well, nothing is more misnamed than common sense.
Very, very true. Very true. Tell me, I mean, at the time of writing, your first book there, and you talked about there the restoration economy, and what was your initial intention with that, and is that book still applicable today?
Oh yeah, I was kind of amazed, really. I mean, I'm not an academic. In fact, my only qualification for writing the restoration economy was the fact that I wrote it. I had no background in the subject whatsoever. I literally was learning as I was writing. And the motivation was, I had been self-employed back in the 80s for a while and loved it. But got to the point, since almost everything I was doing was related to the natural environment, I got to the point where I realized, well, the primary threat to the natural environment is the built environment, and I don't know anything about the built environment. And I didn't want to go back to college. And so I figured, okay, well, probably the best way to learn a new subject is to get a job where people will pay me to learn the subject. And so I looked around, I found this organization, the Construction Specifications Institute, which is a technical society of about 18,000 architects and engineers and construction product manufacturers. And they needed a director of strategic initiatives. So I decided to take on that 9 to 5 job, and it worked out beautifully. I mean, here I was surrounded by all these people involved in the construction industry, and so I spent almost 6 years being paid to learn exactly what I wanted to learn, all about the built environment. And but the trouble was that I knew from the beginning that having been self-employed before, I could maybe last 5 or 6 years in a 9 to 5 environment before I went crazy. So I figured I needed an exit strategy and decided that if I was going to be self-employed in some new field, that writing a book would probably make the best foundation, springboard
Mm.
for a new career. Since back then it wasn't quite as easy to write a book as it is these days. I mean, these days they've got apps where you can just knock out some crap and have a so-called published book in the next day. Um, I'm not saying all self-publishing is bad. My last book was self-published through Amazon's
Mm.
Kindle, um, so it can work out well, but it just opens the door to a lot more garbage than was open before, when it had to actually be approved by a publishing house. My second book was from McGraw-Hill, so I know both sides of the story, and so I decided I needed that exit strategy and that the book would be it. So I started coming in from day one. I came in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I researched and wrote until 9 o'clock. And then at 9 o'clock, I switched over to my 9 to 5 job. And that way, every day I was closer to my goal. And sure enough, at the end of 5 years, I had my book written and published. Came out in 2002, and I immediately left CSI and started earning my living doing talks and consulting and waving my book around, showing what an expert I was.
It's amazing, and well, I mean, that's the perfect qualification for writing a book, is to write the book. It sort of
Yep,
stands
exactly.
for itself. I love that. It's a very simple, but I mean, it almost seems to be a bit of an ethos with yourself, is showing and learning by doing. It's right. It's like,
Yeah, it really only works when you're writing about something that hasn't been written about before.
hmm,
So, I mean, if I were to, you know, write a book on how to restore a historic building, I'd be up against competition from thousands of other books on that subject
hmm,
by people who actually restore buildings for a living, and I'd have absolutely nothing of value to say about it.
hmm. That makes
But
sense.
by taking on a, kind of expanding the scope to a level that nobody had ever written about before, I had carte blanche to be the first. Yeah. There's an old saying in the publishing industry that every every field, every discipline has two great books: the first book on the subject and the best book on the subject.
Very true. Very true. Once you find that niche, yeah, that's what it's all about.
Yep.
Tell me, what's a great example, whether it be I don't know, a country, a city, a town, a project that, sort of a pet project that always sort of connects to your heart, which is a great representation of this, this sort of regeneration, if you like.
Well, the new book, Reconomics, is mostly focused on creating an actual process for bringing a place back to life. It's really weird that every business person on the face of the earth who produces anything, whether it's toothpaste or toilet cleansing powder or trousers or torpedoes or whatever they might be producing, if they reliably produce it, then they have to have a process for doing so. A
Mm,
farmer's got a reliable process for turning sunshine and rain into corn. They know that a process is absolutely essential to reliably produce something. The only people who don't seem to know that are the people who run cities and regions. There, it's all down to the projects. It's always, we've got a project for that, we got a project for that, we got a project for that. Um, but there's no, but they promise revitalization or regeneration or whatever you want to call it, but they don't actually have a process for producing what they're promising. They basically just figure, well, we'll do a lot of good stuff and somehow revitalization will magically appear. And these are the people who are in charge of the future of a place, and they're trusting to magic and hope. It's really weird. So I've in my research, I was looking around for people who actually had invented a process. And the fact is that most people intuitively know that they need to have a process. So in most places, the process that I actually documented in the new book, there are 6 elements to it. And in most places I go to, they have 3 or 4 of the elements. So they knew instinctively that that's the direction they should be going in, but because nobody ever gave them a template, they didn't know what was missing from the process. So what I've created with that 6-step process is kind of a minimum viable process. You can add to it, but you can't take away. A process that's got a missing key step is not a process. And so I started looking around for places that had one of these magical rebirths, and found that the ones the most dramatic and the ones that actually lasted for a long time, they weren't just a flash in the pan, a sudden burst of revitalization, and then just back to misery and devitalization again. The ones that really lasted were the ones who had actually created a complete process. The one that I wrote about in my second book, the McGraw-Hill book, Rewealth, was Chattanooga, Tennessee, which went from being quite literally the filthiest, the most hopeless city in the United States to a poster child of revitalization. And the they I documented in that second book. I had a whole case study on the complete process they put together of how they went from a place where everybody was at each other's throats. They had racial problems, crime problems. They're hemorrhaging jobs like crazy. It was so filthy you had to drive with your headlights on in the middle of the day. The air was so bad, and they basically went from the armpit of America to a place that people always talk about when they want to give an example of a magically revitalized place. Um, so you've actually got a similar sort of story over there on your side of the pond in Liverpool. And you ever heard of the Eldonian community?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, uh, it was a community in northern Liverpool that was settled around the time of the potato famine, mostly by Irish immigrants,
Hmm.
and they created a whole bunch of tenements there, and eventually, as happened all over the place during the 70s, the urban planners decided, well, this place is too poor, it's too destitute, the buildings are in bad repair. We're just going to tear it all down, and you guys can all go to live in these high-rise penitentiary style uh, public housing on the outskirts of town. And these people had developed a really tight-knit community, and they had no intention of being separated from each other. And they fought back in that great Irish tradition,
Hmm.
and they won. They actually fought the city, and they won. And they created a housing cooperative, and they were given the rights to redevelop a huge site of an old sugar factory. And they created their whole new community there, revitalized the whole place, and it's still going strong today. So it's another great example of a place that created the whole process, the vision, the strategy, the policies, the ongoing program, the projects, the partnerships. They did it all. So the Chattanooga and the Eldonian community in Liverpool were very, very similar stories that used very much the same approach to and the interesting thing was, just like Chattanooga people, these folks, they're called Eldonian because the central street there was Eldon Street. And they, uh, they, even though I said it was a tight knit community, their challenge was that this whole overall community was divided into tiny, tiny little parishes. Each one had its own church, its own priest, and they had absolutely no interest in what was going on in any of the other parishes, even though it was overall an Irish immigrant community. Uh, if you went one street over, you might as well be in another country entirely. But as a result of the common enemy of the Liverpool City Council that wanted to wipe their overall community out, that common enemy brought them together and they learned how to cooperate.
Isn't it funny how a negative influence can trigger a positive one?
Yep.
It's that sort of learning
Yeah,
lesson.
in Chattanooga's case, it was national shame. Are you old enough to remember who Walter Cronkite was?
No, unfortunately
Yeah,
not.
he's probably the most famous American newscaster back in the 50s and 60s, and most beloved newscaster ever in this country. And he went on national TV one day and called Chattanooga the filthiest city in America. And that national shame is what brought everybody together, blacks and whites and poor and wealthy, to figure out how they can correct that situation.
Wow, isn't it amazing how one thing can trigger another, and
Yep.
that's is that awareness, is that knowledge, what is it, or is it a perception or a contrast that actually, I don't know, just helping people see what's possible?
The key thing there was that in their case, what they had to do was fix their air quality problem. And the good news was that the EPA had recently been created and they had recently passed the Clean Air Act. So the EPA actually had some teeth with which to punish or reward places for doing the right thing for their air quality. And Chattanooga initially didn't come together to revitalize the place. They came together just to fix their air quality problem. And they actually became the EPA's first award-winning city for clean air. And it was the process of working together to clean their air that made them realize that they could actually work together. And they said, well, hell, now that we're working together, what do we do next? And some bright person said, well, let's revitalize the city. And that was you need a catalyst. And in many ways, you need a leader. In the case of the Eldonian community in Liverpool, they had one charismatic leader, George McCann, who brought them together, somebody they trusted from within the community. In Chattanooga's case, you could say it was kind of, there was a local foundation that became the trusted leader and that provided the funding for them to create an ongoing organization, to create a vision for the future.
What have you found to be the most effective? I mean, we have a local term here. Do you sell do you sell the sausage or do you sell the sizzle? I'm just wondering what is the, is it a shame factor you find being the best motivator? Is it money? Is it, opportunity? What do you find, what's been the common occurrence of change?
Well, there hasn't been any real common type of catalyst. What the commonality is the fact that there has to be a catalyst. Otherwise, just people just get used to every year being worse than the year before. So there has to be a catalyst that wakes them up and makes them realize that the time has come for action. And the biggest problem is the whole creeping crud sort of situation where a place just gets more devitalized, more toxic, more depressed with each year. And one of the big problems is the planning industry. And it's not so much the industry itself, but the way the elected leaders use it. Politicians love to get up in front of the news media and ballyhoo their good news about what they're doing to make the future better. Every politician promises revitalization. Very few of them fulfill those promises, and very few of them even have the qualifications to make such a promise because they don't know how revitalization happens. So what they do is they commission a plan. And they say, and then they get up in front of the news media and say, good news, we have a revitalization plan on the way. And so that's all positive stuff. It's a feather in their cap, and there's no risk. All they have to do is write a check. And a year or so later, the plan is delivered. They get up in front again. They get another feather in their cap for delivering the plan, and still no risk. And the risk comes in implementation. All of a sudden, if you try to implement the plan, you might fail. And so they don't want to actually do anything that could be considered a failure. So the plan goes on the shelf, and 5 or 10 years later, they say, guess what? Our plan needs an update. So they commission an updated plan, another feather in their cap with no risk, and the cycle just keeps going and going. And most cities have shelves full of previous comprehensive plans, revitalization plans, strategic plans. They're all on the shelf. And it's demoralizing because after a while, the citizens get to think, well, we've tried many times before to revitalize, and it just doesn't work. This place is just not revitalizable, if such a word exists. We might as well just give up. And it's all because of these phony efforts based on plans.
Isn't it fun, as you say? I mean, you actually get then more. Oh, I mean, what is it? People just become immune to it because, as you say, there's a shelf full of bright ideas, but not one of them has hit the ground to become tangible.
Yep.
And therefore, you just say, well, that's just another idea. Or, as you say, the last one didn't work. It's like, well, hold on, it never actually hit the ground. So that's why it didn't work.
Right. Yeah. Are you old enough to remember who Dwight Eisenhower was?
No.
Yeah, you're younger than you look. Well, that didn't come out right.
That's okay. Hard life. It's okay.
So anyway, Dwight Eisenhower was the American commander who became the supreme Allied commander towards the end of the World War II. And he's the one who led the D-Day invasion and all that. The one who was primarily responsible for convincing Americans that we're the ones that won the war. Even though we only did a little bit of cleanup work towards the end, the Russians did all the heavy lifting. And you guys certainly did all the suffering, or well, you guys and the Russians and the Poles and all the other ones did the suffering. We wouldn't have any impacts on our end. But we're still convinced over here that we won the war for you. But Dwight Eisenhower came in towards the end there and did the D-Day thing and ended up becoming president of the United States. And he had a famous saying. Actually, he had a lot of famous sayings. One of them was, beware the military-industrial complex. I mean, people had talked about it before, but never before had the highest level military commander and president of the United States warned us that there was such a thing as a military industrial complex that profited from war and that would continue to instigate further wars to make money. Anyway, he was a fairly enlightened fellow by those standards. And one of the things he said was that planning is vital, but plans are useless.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, those documents are killers because as soon as a plan is in document form, it's frozen. It becomes a snapshot of the past, and every day that goes by, it's more outdated. And worse yet, it stifles innovation because somebody comes up with a great idea and they say, well, no, we can't do that. It's not in the plan.
So what's your plan, Storm? And are you on the right path?
It certainly seems so. I mean, I'm having the time of my life, earning a decent living, doing, got a wonderful lifestyle with my wife, Maria. We get to travel, well, this year accepted. We get to travel a lot, and the kinds of work I do, helping to revitalize places is just endlessly fascinating because every day is different. One day I'm working on a brownfields cleanup and redevelopment project. Next day I'm working on coral reef restoration or watershed restoration or, community revitalization. It never gets old.
Well, just refreshing. And I suppose some of these are lifetime plans, aren't they? I mean, this is not just we started last year and project finished, we're all done, right? These are long-term things.
Yeah, and now I'm trying to focus on things that will outlive me. I've just finally, very belatedly, got into podcasting. How long have you been doing it?
Only 2 years now, but
Oh, okay. Well, you're way ahead of me. I just started about 2 months ago. But you're familiar with the Patreon
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
platform? Yeah. So what I decided to do was instead of just doing all these videos and talks for people at conferences that basically just disappear, that I'd start doing podcasts. I'm starting with audio versions of my 3 books, and each podcast is another chapter. So it's not a podcast in the sense that this is a podcast. I'm not interviewing anybody in those. I will eventually. But then I'm also doing videos, the kinds of videos I would normally, kinds of presentations I would normally do at conferences. I'm recording those and putting those on Patreon. It's called the Regeneration Team. And it's basically a way that, especially young folks, since they're more podcast and online video oriented than old farts like me, I put it on Patreon to make it really quick and easy for anybody on the planet to access these resources, and have them basically be there as permanent resources. Um, Not that I have any plans to leave anywhere anytime soon.
I like that. I mean, I mean, do you have a legacy or a purpose? Where would you like to see it at?
Well, I mean, I'm already seeing people using the terms restoration economy all over the place. People I've never heard of, and restorative development and all kinds of terminology that I invented, and people talking about, how, we need a vision and a strategy, and how we need all these different elements of the process. So, in most cases, they don't mention me. In many cases, they didn't even hear it directly from my books or my videos. They heard it from somebody else who might have read my book or heard a talk. So just seeing the stuff out there, getting into the public dialogue, is more than enough legacy for me. I mean, I didn't invent all of this restoration, regeneration, revitalization stuff, but I think I can take at least a little bit of credit for accelerating the trend.
Absolutely. I mean, but I suppose, I mean, you've had, listen, and I suppose we're all where we're supposed to be, right? So having views of, Eastern culture and traveling and things like that, that gives you a very wide, diverse exposure to different ideas, different, you know, sort of areas of the globe, and how everyone deals with some it's a problem, some it's an opportunity, right? So you've
Yep.
at least seen that diversity.
Yeah, it also helped that I grew up in Britain for a few years anyway. My mother was a war bride. So I spent my first few years in Britain, and I think that has always kind of kept my mind more open than the average Americans. Even though I've spent uh, 95% of my life here,
Hmm.
that kind of widened perspective never really goes away.
Tell me this. I mean, what as a young, a young storm? I mean, what was your original plan? What did you want to do when you grew up? Do you know? Did you have an idea?
I knew it'd be something to do with nature. I started off as an amateur entomologist. I just loved insects, and that fairly quickly shifted into herpetology, which has become a lifelong passion. Reptiles and amphibians. Uh, Everywhere I go, I'm interacting with the snakes and the turtles and the lizards as much as possible. And so it was that love of nature that really got me into this whole restoration thing, and the scuba diving, watching reefs come back to life. Most people think of me as an urban revitalization type of guy, but really I ended up focusing on that because that's where the money is. Uh, but the first love was nature.
That's the actual explanation, is it? And being in nature and from that side.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'd much rather be in it than just talking about it.
So
Speaking of which, I need to get out into nature. See ya.
make the most. Absolutely. I mean, time and money, no object. What would you be doing?
This.
You're living it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so powerful.
Yeah, I'd probably If time and money were no object, I'd probably do it from somewhere else, probably somewhere in Mexico or maybe Panama. Two of the places I love the most. As long as I've got a good internet connection. I've been to places in Mexico that have much faster internet than we have here in Virginia.
What keeps you in Virginia then, out of interest?
My wife's a doctor. She's got a clientele here, so until she's ready to hang that up and switch into probably full volunteer mode in some place that really needs free healthcare, which is probably coming up pretty soon. We'll probably take off at that point. Maybe find ourselves in Oaxaca.
So tell me, I mean, what for you is there sort of certain key things that are simple successes, let's say, that that people can, anyone could essentially implement?
Well, you got to beware of simple solutions to complex problems. What I've tried to do with this process is provide a simple way of organizing a lot of very complex and difficult tasks. So it's not a solution unto itself. It's basically a path to a solution. You still got to do all the hard work and which in the real world becomes very frustrating, no matter how inspiring your mission may be. You're always going to have to deal with ugly people and not very bright institutions. So that's why I try not to do anything useful. I just try to talk about it. I really don't need those sorts of hassles of actually making real world changes. But the simplest thing somebody could do, this is going to sound very self-serving, but it's the truth, would be to get certified as a revitalization and resilience facilitator. You go to reconomics.org, get that certification. It's not going to make you an expert in getting things done all in one fell swoop, but it provides the kind of qualification you need to get into a position that'll give you the experience to become a true expert. Right now, most places that want to revitalize don't have any way of knowing how to hire a person who understands the process of revitalizing. And so that's basically what this certification does. People put RE after their name when they get certified, and it gives mayors and city councils or regeneration firms the ability to actually find a person and say, oh, here's somebody who understands that overall revitalization process. Let's put them on the team.
So tell me, talk to us about your latest book there, and really what was it that sort of triggered you to write it and to bring it out then? Was it?
Well, I only put out a book every 6 or 7 years, and I'll probably do a second edition of this one, updated with more stories and examples. I seriously doubt I'll be writing a fourth book. I don't think there'll be any need for it. This one has really captured the most important lessons that I need to impart. So this one, the first one, you could look at the restoration economy as being kind of about the ingredients of revitalization, all the different kinds of restorative projects you can do that would revitalize different kinds of properties. The second book, Rewealth, was more about the recipe for those ingredients. How do you put all those different kinds of restorative projects together to get the revitalization, the quality of life improvement, the jobs, economic growth that people really want when they do those sorts of things? And so that kind of set the stage for the last book, Reconomics, which really distills it into a reliable process. The second one was more based on showing the recipe based on case studies and here's what other people have done. So the third book took that and distilled into a much more concise, easily replicable process.
Well, and in terms of, I mean, for you and when you're teaching and suppose lecturing is how many of those sort of experiences in the outer world? I mean, how many, do you find people themselves need to regenerate? Do people themselves need to sort of revitalize themselves to get through
Hmm.
this?
Funny you should say that. It's one of my favorite sayings, one of my own sayings that I've been using for a long time is that what we restore restores us.
Hmm.
What we revitalize revitalizes us. I've noticed this everywhere I go, that people who are involved in restoring nature are themselves very, very revitalized people, and people who are involved in revitalizing neighborhoods and communities themselves are very vibrant and full of life. And in many cases, they came from a background of being exactly the opposite. And that it was getting involved in a restoration or revitalization project that revitalized them.
Yeah. Gosh, no, there's a saying I quite often I like to sort of see it. I think it's quite informative. But it's along the lines of your voids are your values, and so when you're
Hmm.
seeking and searching for something that becomes of a high value for you,
Right.
and it's along that thing as you say, if you want to restore something, quite often it's because you need to restore or you need to be there. So I love
Hmm.
that. I love that sort of um, you know. Do you find? I mean, is there a volunteer network going with this, or do you find is it mainly people who are this is part of their their sort of day-to-day work, or is it cities? Who's listening the most at this time?
A lot of the people who are getting certified as revitalization resilience facilitators are not looking to do it professionally. These are just
Mm.
people who really care about their community. And in some cases, they're in a position like mayor or deputy mayor or something like that, where they want to be more valuable to their community as a result of what they learn in this course. But in other cases, they are purely volunteer. They're not earning any money in any way from serving their city. They just want to know this stuff so that when they show up at city community meetings of some sort, that they can actually say something useful. But I'd say the majority of them are people who want to restore the planet for a living or revitalize communities for a living. People, in many cases, they're architects or engineers or professional planners or elected officials who are looking at this as a way to boost their careers.
And what lessons did you take? I mean, coming from the Green Berets and you know that side, and really through, what did you take forward? Did you learn? I suppose as to where you are now.
Um, well, if you're talking specifically about my military experience, um, I guess the three things I took out of that are still a major part of my life today would be first scuba diving, and the adjunct to that is the kind of the second lesson um, was that you can actually be paid to do stuff that's fun or rewarding. I mean, granted, the Army's got a really excellent way of removing the fun from scuba diving. They tend to do it in a in a way that's rather stressful. But the fact is that they paid me to go to Key West, Florida, which is a place most people go to on vacation, and paid me to go there and learn how to scuba dive. And that really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, if you choose your opportunities carefully, the kinds of stuff that you might pay money to do, you can actually be paid to do. You've got to raise your standards a bit and
Hmm.
say, okay, my next job is going to teach me a valuable skill that's going to open up new opportunities for me. It's going to be fun and it's going to be lucrative. Yeah. Just raise the standards. So many people have very low standards, just any job will do, as long as I've got a paycheck. And yeah, that tends not to lead to joy. Um, and the other thing the Special Forces taught me was the value of strategy. Everybody uses the word strategy, but so few people really know what it is. I go to talking to mayors all the time, who tell me they're going to revitalize their city. And I ask them, oh, great. What's your strategy? And they'll say, oh, well, here it is. And they'll pull a 300-page plan off the shelf. And there you go. And I say, no, excuse me, that's a plan. What's your strategy? And they'll say, oh, well, yeah, well, our strategy is to improve our quality of life and grow our jobs and be a beautiful place that everybody enjoys living in. And I'll say, no, that's a vision. What's your strategy for achieving that vision? What's your strategy for overcoming the primary obstacles to achieving that vision? And about that time, they'll throw up their hands in frustration and walk away, realizing that they don't really know what a strategy is. And all a strategy is a technique for achieving success. That's it. It's the flip side of a vision. If you've got a vision without a strategy, you've got a daydream. If you got a strategy without a vision, then you've got a really excellent place of going nowhere, a really excellent way for going nowhere. So you got to have the vision and the strategy together. And the strategy has got to be brief enough that you can keep it in your head. If you have to pull it off the shelf and read it, it's not going to guide your day-to-day decisions, which is what a strategy has to do. It's got to guide your decision-making towards that vision. So in many cases, a strategy is only a sentence or two. Best strategy for community revitalization I know of is only 3 words: repurpose, renew, reconnect. And that's behind some of the most spectacular revitalization successes on the planet.
It's so strong in its simplicity, right? It doesn't
Yep.
have to be, as you say, 300-page documents.
Yeah, just a few verbs. Strategies are verb oriented, visions are noun oriented and adjective oriented.
And I love that, even, and sort of an example you used earlier, saying it's using a very simple solution to a complex problem, right? It's the same thing. It doesn't have to be, sort of produced by multiple levels of consultants and all the rest. It's just having the clarity and the vision.
Yeah, but the consultants don't make their money off of delivering 3 words.
Well, yeah, it's it's even, but the simplest designs are the cleverest too, right? It's getting a bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got another meeting coming up pretty
Cool.
soon.
Perfect. Well, listen, I mean, first thing I would say is, in 1 or 2 words, what would you describe as your fire in the belly?
Well, it would have to be the words. So, I mean, everything I do has to do with those 3 words I just mentioned as being the ideal strategy: repurpose, renew, reconnect. Looking around, finding assets, whether they're natural or built, that need a new purpose. And once you find a new purpose for them, a viable new purpose for them, then you can raise the money you need to renew them, which is that second step. And once you've renewed them, where most people forget, the third step is what usually goes by the wayside. But what you can do that doubles or triples the return on investment from what you've done previously in the repurposing and the renewing is reconnecting. There's so many communities and ecosystems that are disconnected. They've been fragmented from the overall system, and they'll never come back to life fully until they're properly reconnected.
Well, it's powerful. So, Storm, where can people follow you, reach out, hunt you down, track you down, follow you, see what's happening?
Well, probably the easiest thing would be just go to stormcunningham.com, and that's my normal speaking and consulting site. And on that homepage, you'll find links to everything else I do: Reconomics Institute, the 3 books, the Patreon regeneration team. Everything's there at stormcunningham.com.
Perfect. And final thought or an idea you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Just remember that when you're feeling a bit depressed about the mess the world is in, that you don't have to be satisfied with aiming for sustaining. That you can restore it. You can undo this mess, and you can actually earn a living doing it.
Well, I like that. Don't aim to sustain. Just aim to restore. I love that.
Yep.
Simple. Storm, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Mighty Pete.
Yep. Until the next time. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.